Hey, welcome back to the Next Gen podcast. I'm Jeff Baxter, your host, and I want to follow up. Earlier in the month, we had a great guest on, Dr. Chap Clark. He's a friend, a mentor. He's who I studied underneath when I was getting my doctorate at Fuller Theological Seminary in youth and family ministry. And he referred to some things that might be new for many of the listeners on this podcast and videocast. And I want to talk about the adolescent years for a little while with you and refer to some of the terms that he was referring to. He was talking about mosaic and avatars and what adolescents are doing these days because of how fast-paced things are. And I've gotten the honor to be able to talk about these things in parenting classes before, and we're doing the same thing here at our church. But I want to talk to you, and if you're happen to be tuning in on the video, you'll be able to see the adolescent years. I want to talk to you about that term, what it means, how it applies to us as parents, teachers, coaches, administrators, because times have changed. I don't know if you've noticed, but times have changed, and primarily because of the internet, the World Wide Web, our cell phones, things have changed dramatically, and things have changed for our kids dramatically. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and I hope you're able to follow along and see my PowerPoint presentation as I'm talking about these things with you. But let's talk about the adolescent years together, if we would. Have you seen this expression before? On the screen is mellow, bummed, stoked, funky, dumped, fried, rattled, all these old school words, but the same expression is there for every single adolescent, because if you're a parent, you know it's really hard to know how to read your kid, because when they hit about 11 years old-ish, all of a sudden they don't really express themselves with their faces very easily. So I'm sure you've seen this before. But let me give you a little bit of the history of adolescence to catch us up to speed in the 1800s to today. I mean, times have changed. We are no longer living with Little House on the Prairie days where, Laura went from child to adult overnight. I mean, she became like 14, 15 years old, and all of a sudden now she was grown up. Well, that has all changed now. Things have gotten longer and slower. And maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but adolescence comes from the Latin word adolescere, which literally means just to grow up. It's a word that psychology and psychosocial development experts started to term this unique phase because they realized that there's something going on between childhood and adulthood. So all of a sudden now they're talking about adolescere or adolescence, which means to grow up. So by the way, teenager is not equal adolescence. It's different. Teenager is based on a number from 13 to 19 because of the teen. It's a teenager. But for adolescence, you're going to see really quickly that the numbers are not quite the same as from 13 to 19. So the goal of adolescence is the word called individuation. It's becoming an individual. I mean, that's the goal. As parents, we, from a very young age, our goal is to have our kids grow up and leave the house. We don't want them to stay in the house forever, right? We want them to move on and become responsible, caring adults. And if they're hopefully followers of Jesus who are carrying on the mission into the world, we want them to individuate. We want them to become individuals. It's the process of becoming a unique individual that contributes to society, that lives on their own, that's responsible, all the things that go with that. But the three tasks of individuation or becoming an individual, this is very important, especially if you're a parent or a coach of anywhere between 11-year-olds through mid-20s. You need to understand these three words are critical, and every single 11 to 20-something is intuitively working on these things, and we get to see it in living color. Number one is identity. Who am I? They're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to figure out not just theologically who they are in Jesus, but they're trying to figure out who they are in the world. And some of the struggles, I'll go on a bit of a rabbit trail right here. Some of the struggles in our world today, as you know and I know, and I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it, has to do with their gender, sexuality, and they identify as one of these. But the reality is their identity is not in their gender or sexuality. Who they are is not wrapped up in those things. Who they are as a follower of Jesus is a Jesus follower, a follower of Jesus. That's who their identity is. But every single adolescent is trying to figure out who they are. The other thing they're trying to do is figure out, do I matter? And that seems like a strange question, but it's about autonomy. They're trying to figure out, do I matter? Do I matter to people? Do I matter in the world? Do I matter to anyone? Do they really care about me for me or not? And every single argument that a parent has in their home all has to do with power and control about autonomy, on whether they matter, whether they can make their own decisions, whether they can have the car, whether they can have their allowance, whether they can make their own decisions on their curfew. It's about power and control. All the arguments I've ever had with my own 3 kids has been about power and control. They want to be independent, which is exactly what we want them to be, right? We want them to be independent. So they're fighting for their autonomy, but sometimes they're not quite ready for it yet. And so we lean in and we rightfully provide boundaries and margins and say, you know what, staying up till 3 a.m. is probably not a good idea with your friends. You probably ought to be home at 11. And so we set up some boundaries and we negotiate with our kids, at least we should, but it's all about power and control. And then finally, belonging. Does anyone care about me for me? This is so critical, and this is what Dr. Chap Clark was referring to earlier in the month with the interview. He was talking about how, well, kids believe that their value is based on what they do, their performance, their grades and their goals. Whether they got a good grade on that test, whether they have a good GPA, whether they're going to get a good scholarship. People only love me because of what I do for them, or the goals I score on the soccer field, or the number of points I put on the basketball court, or whether I nailed that performance in theater or in band. They are believing, because their perception is reality, that I'm only loved based on what I do. And what we want to do, obviously, as caring adults, as parents, coaches, teachers, administration, is we want to come alongside of them and love them for them. It does not matter what they do. It does not matter if they fail. We still unconditionally love them. They're wondering, does anyone care about me for me? Or do you just care about me because I perform for you? I live up to your expectations. And so this is a very big deal for us to think through. So those 3 questions you ought to be thinking about. They're wondering and trying to figure out, who am I? Do I matter? Does anyone care about me for me? So the timing and duration of adolescence, as I mentioned already, is not the teenage years. It's longer than that. So it begins in puberty. We can measure when a girl's puberty is based on governmental records. We know what the average age of a girl's puberty is. It's harder to measure in guys, but it is easy to measure in girls. We know when that starts. And then, here we go. Chewbacca, they become an adolescent and it gets nuts and crazy. And all of a sudden they grow things that we didn't even know that existed. And then adulthood happens and you hit 40 and you become a, football coach or a teacher or a pastor or whatever. And everything lands and you're doing great, right? And Chewbacca starts losing his hair. Well, the timing and duration of adolescence, and I'm not going to belabor this, I'm going to go pretty quickly, is in the pre-1900s, we knew from governmental records, we know for sure when a girl hit her puberty based on her visits to the doctor. We could figure it out. We knew that it was the average age is 14 when a girl hit puberty. Now, they say adolescence begins in biology and ends in culture. So it begins in biology because of a period, and it ends in culture based on responsibility and becoming an individual, and they've individuated, as I mentioned already. But then in culture, back in pre-1900s, they became a full-fledged adult at 16 years old. This is Little House on the Prairie. This is why they would get married at 16, 17, 18 years old and start having a family. And it's not just a TV show, it was real. And it's because there was no such thing as adolescence. They went from child to adult. It seemed like overnight. Then you get to 1980. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. Some of you might have too. And the average age of a girl hitting puberty was 13. So now it's going down. And when do they individuate? When do they become a full-fledged member? When are they ready to leave the house? Well, about 18, 19, 20 years old. And that made a lot of sense. In the 80s, all of my friends wanted to leave high school. They could not wait to go to college or go to whatever they're going to go to, trade school, whatever it was. They could not wait, and they were ready to go at 18, 19 years old. They're ready to launch. But oh, how times have changed today. The average age of puberty today is 11 for girls. Girls in the United States and in the West are starting their periods at around 11 years old. That number is lower in African-American communities for a girl. It's incredible. 9, 10 years old. A girl in African-American communities will start their periods on average. And then when does it end? When do they get out of adolescence? Well, you feel this today as a parent, coach, teacher. You know that it's getting longer, and it's probably in the mid to late 20s. We know this because of brain development. We know this that the frontal lobe of the brain is not fully developed, which has to do with the responsibility part and forward thinking, and that my decisions have consequences. All that is getting longer and longer. A lot of people are wrestling, and theologians and scholars in psychosocial development are wrestling about why this is happening, but it's probably happening because of a combination of things, because of our culture, because of diet, actually, because of social media, because of our cell phones, because the world is moving at Mach speeds today. And obviously back in the 1900s, it was not moving that fast. You grew up in the same community, you lived in the same community, you probably did the same occupation that your mom or dad did. But today, things are moving at Mach speeds, and obviously we're a global community. You can move anywhere and do anything you want to, and all that's contributing to adolescence getting longer. It's getting longer. And so changes of the journey, obviously 1930 to 1980, I've given you a little tightrope there. And hit puberty around 13, 1930 to 1980. And then they're in the middle of adolescence at 15, and they get out of adolescence at 18 years old. And that's the way it looked. And they would go across this tightrope, and they would be helpful, and people would support them. And now that's not the case today. They were dependent on mainly mom. It was maternal before 13 years old. It makes sense. You know, a mom carries a baby, and then they're dependent on mom to nurse and all the things. And mom is very much a part of their lives in elementary school. And then they become more independent as they're going through adolescence. And then they would finally become interdependent on their God, hopefully, and in the church, we hope. And high school is in the center of that whole thing. And that's what adolescence was. It was pretty much high school. But times have changed today. Now it's dependent until about 11 years old. And then adolescence is getting longer, where they're fighting for their independence, and we want them to be interdependent. But what's interesting is now it's stretched to middle school, high school, young adult age, the next generation. I put up these pictures up here because they kind of symbolize helicopter parents and snowplow parents. And so what's happened is parents have become fearful and full of anxiety because they feel this happening and they don't know why is this adolescent thing happening in my own home. I see my kid fighting for independence. I see them wanting to be on their own, but I don't know what to do about that. So I'm going to hover. I'm going to be close. I'm going to get apps like the 360 app, and I'm going to track their every move, and I'm going to make sure everything's okay. And when things don't go well at school, I'm going to swoop in. And when they don't go well with my coach, I'm going to swoop in because I don't know what to do because they're not graduating from high school and ready to launch. Now, some are, some do, some are doing great, but most aren't, and parents are panicking. And so now today, obviously, middle school and high school and college young adults is what's stretching into this whole next generation journey. This whole term is called egocentric abstraction. What is egocentric abstraction? Well, in the psychosocial development world, what that means is basically shrunk down to a small definition is adolescents know that they impact everybody else around them, but they don't care. They know they impact everybody else around them, but they don't care because they're in survival mode. They're just trying to get by. They're trying to figure out their identity, their autonomy, and their belonging. They're trying to figure out, who am I? Do I matter? Do people love me for me? And now with social media world, now they're stretching into trying to find groups they identify with and go along with. And they're going to go into their own echo chambers and listen to the people. They're going to affirm them for them. When the rest of us ought to be doing that, but we don't. We fall short, and they feel like they're measured by their performance. They're measured by their grades and their goals, as I mentioned. And this is the tragedy that's happening today. And we can turn the tide, though. We can turn the tide. We can help them become interdependent on their God, following Jesus, being connected to the church. But it's going to take all of us together joining forces to make that happen. And so I love this quote by Alison Gopnik, who's a professor of psychology. She said, if you think the teenage brain is a car, today's adolescents acquire an accelerator long time before they can steer or brake. And I'll bet that parents, coaches, teachers out there, they feel this. They feel a teenager's they literally get a car, they get a license at 16 years old, which is crazy, by the way. Now that we know what we know. And then they hit the acceleration. It's kind of like if you went to an archery range and I said to you, ready, fire, aim, that's the way most adolescents are living their lives. It's ready, fire, and then they aim later on. And it's because their brain development isn't there. It's because psychosocially it's not there, and because the culture is moving really, really fast right now. And so that's a lot I just unpacked. And Dr. Chap Clark referred to, obviously they take on different selves. They pull from a mosaic of life. They pull from being an athlete, being a student, being a brother or sister, being a grandchild, being their social media self. They pull all this and they become their own avatars. That's what he was referring to the last time in the interview. They become their own avatars, and they have a different avatar for everything they're moving along with. And so they're not faking it. They're being real, but they can only be so much because they're an adolescent. Now, listen, there are so many adolescents who are getting it right and moving forward, and it's because their family systems are in place and they're being surrounded by Christ-following adults who are loving them and supporting them for who they are, not for what they do. But many, many adolescents are delayed in growing up because of their brain development and because they don't have the structure around them from parents, coaches, teachers, adults, pastors who need to come alongside and love them for who they are. So I have said a lot right there in this podcast, and I'm guessing you might want to go back and listen to it. And I've got some classes we're going to post online through our church to unpack a lot of this more. And the interview is coming up. I'm quite certain we'll cover more of this information, but I wanted to just kind of scratch where it itched right now and talk to you about these issues about adolescent development. And it might start to make sense of why your student, your child is acting the way they are when they hit about 11 through the mid-20s. It's because they're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to figure out where they matter, and they're trying to figure out if anybody loves them for just them and not based on their performance. So I encourage you, here's an action step for today. Go love the next generation for just being human, for just existing, for just being there. Not based on what they do, not based on their attitudes, not based on their grades or their goals. Just love them for them. Thanks for tuning in this time on the Next Gen podcast. Again, be sure to subscribe, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks so much. This podcast is hosted by me, Jeff Baxter, along with special guests who are experts in the industry. We're mixed and edited by Leopard Productions. Our senior producer is Colin McFarland. Our video director is Zach Anderson, and our digital and SEO specialist is Maddie Brower. The Next Gen podcast is part of a Mission Hills podcast network here at Littleton, Colorado. Thanks for listening.